I still remember the day the envelope arrived. No return address. Just my name, Elias Grant, written in my son's handwriting. I hadn't spoken to Connor in a few weeks, not since he told me Savannah's parents were more involved in the planning of the wedding. I assumed it was an invitation, maybe a late one. I was wrong. Inside was a card with gold trim and embossed lettering, the kind you'd expect from a fairy tale wedding. It read, "Mr. Elias Grant, due to the preferences of the bride and the nature of our guest list, your presence is respectfully declined." Beneath that was a typed note. "We hope you'll understand. However, your financial contribution toward the celebration and honeymoon remains appreciated." No signature. Just a printed line that read, "Connor and Savannah." I sat with the card in my lap for a full hour, not angry, not crying, just still. I didn't even notice when the sun went down. The words burned hotter than any fight we'd ever had. I wasn't just excluded, I was expected to foot the bill for it. Like a silent investor in a company, I was barred from entering. It wasn't always like this. I raised Connor alone for most of his childhood after Denise, my ex-wife, moved 3 states away and decided that a fresh start didn't include shared custody. I was the one packing lunches, sewing buttons, sitting through talent shows and late-night fevers. I gave him everything I could, sometimes too much. I made sure he never felt the hole his mother left. I never let him see me struggle, even when I did. And now, not only was I uninvited to his wedding, I was expected to celebrate it from a distance by paying the bill. I didn't tell anyone right away. Not my coworkers, not my sister Janice. I didn't want pity. I didn't want advice. I just wanted time to sit with the weight of it. There's a silence that comes when you realize your child has stopped seeing you as a father and started seeing you as a wallet. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, it's just hollow. The next morning, I looked at the envelope again. There was a formal, itemized estimate tucked inside. $80,000. $80,000. Venue deposit, premium catering, luxury honeymoon suite, flights, gown enhancements, custom rings, live orchestra. Orchestra. He hadn't called to ask. Hadn't visited. Just mailed me the bill like I was a bank. I thought about the last conversation we had. He'd mentioned how Savannah's family was classy, how they were excited to host the event at her parents' vineyard in Napa. I didn't think much of it then. I smiled and nodded and said, "Just don't forget where you come from." Apparently he had. But the strangest part was, I wasn't angry, not yet. I wasn't vengeful. I was just disappointed in a way that felt too old to cry about. This wasn't about the money, it was about something deeper. I felt like I'd been erased, rewritten, replaced. I walked into my home office and opened my desk drawer. I pulled out the old photo of Connor on his 10th birthday, holding up a lopsided cake I'd made after working a double shift. He was smiling so big you could count every missing tooth. Back then, I was everything. Now I was just a name on a check. That night, I made myself a cup of coffee and sat on the porch. I looked out at the driveway he used to learn how to ride his bike, the mailbox he used to run to, hoping for birthday cards from his grandparents. Every corner of this house carried a story I wrote, with time, sweat, sacrifice. And now, in the final chapter of this father-son story, he'd closed the door without even knocking. I wasn't sure what I was going to do yet. I hadn't made any decisions, but one thing was clear. If Connor thought I would silently fund my own exclusion, he didn't know me at all. I used to believe that if you gave everything for your family, they'd never forget you. That they'd remember the little sacrifices, the sleepless nights, the skipped meals, the missed promotions. I believed that love, when poured in quietly and consistently, would one day be returned. I was wrong. The more I gave, the less they seemed to remember. And now, standing on the edge of this betrayal, I couldn't help but wonder, had I raised a son who truly didn't see me anymore? Or had he seen me all along and just didn't care? It started years ago, really. Long before the wedding. Back when Connor graduated college and got his first job in the city. I remember driving 4 hours just to take him out for dinner to celebrate. I made reservations at a nice Italian place he used to love as a kid. I wore the same blazer I wore to his high school graduation. I even brought a small gift. Just a card and a vintage compass I'd kept from my Navy days, the one he used to play with as a boy. He showed up 20 minutes late. No apology. Barely glanced at the compass. Told me his real celebration was happening that weekend, with Savannah and her friends. I brushed it off. Told myself he was busy, overwhelmed, trying to impress his new circle. I kept showing up. Holidays, birthdays, promotions. I'd send care packages, offer to help with rent when the tech job turned shaky during COVID. He never asked. But he never refused either. He'd say, "Thanks, Dad, you're a lifesaver," then go quiet for weeks. I told myself he was just independent. I didn't want to be the clingy parent. I thought giving space was a form of respect. What I didn't realize was that he wasn't seeing space as respect. He was seeing it as distance. And eventually, as indifference. One Christmas, I offered to host dinner. Just something small. Me, Connor, Savannah, my sister Janice, and her husband. Connor said they already had plans. Savannah's family does this big chalet thing up in Aspen. It's kind of their tradition now. I spent that Christmas alone, microwaving leftover lasagna and watching reruns of old holiday specials. When Connor finally called 2 days later, it was to thank me for the check I'd mailed him as a gift. He didn't ask how my Christmas was, didn't even pretend. That was the year I began to understand. Not fully, but enough. I realized that somewhere along the way, I had stopped being someone he celebrated with and started being someone who financed the celebration. I became convenient, predictable, and maybe worst of all, replaceable. It wasn't just Connor. My ex-wife Denise had started showing signs of that same selective memory years ago. When the divorce was finalized, she moved on quickly. Built a new life with a man who had a yacht and a retirement home in Arizona. She called Connor often, sent gifts, played the fun parent. Meanwhile, I was the one making dentist appointments, sitting through piano recitals, and fighting with insurance companies when he broke his arm on the trampoline. I never asked for credit. But I never thought I'd be forgotten either. I remember once when Connor was 13, he got into a fight at school defending a younger student from a bully. The principal called me in, expecting outrage. Instead, I told Connor in front of him, "I'm proud of you. Don't ever apologize for standing up for someone who can't." That night, he wrote me a note on notebook paper. "Dad, I want to be just like you." I kept that note for years, tucked it into my wallet. It's probably still there, wrinkled and fading. So how do we go from that to this? I wish I had an easy answer. I wish I could blame Savannah or Denise or some outside influence, but deep down I know the truth. Somewhere along the line I taught my son that I would always be there, that no matter how I was treated, I'd still show up, still give, still support. And he believed me, took me at my word, pushed the boundary, then kept pushing. I used to think family was unconditional, that no matter what happened, we'd always find our way back to each other. But now I see it differently. Family isn't just blood, it's memory, effort, presence. When someone chooses to forget you, when they rewrite the story so that your chapters don't matter, it's no longer family. It's fiction. That realization didn't come with fireworks. It came slowly. Like a sunset you don't notice until the streetlights flicker on. And by then, the dark has already settled in. I wish I could say the invoice shocked me, that it felt like some cruel joke or clerical error. But in truth, it didn't surprise me at all. It was just confirmation. Proof that whatever line separated me from being Connor's father and being his financier had long since vanished. The invoice was stapled to the inside of the card, professionally printed, itemized down to the penny. Venue, $35,000. Catering, $9,200. Honeymoon resort, $11,800. Flights, $14,400. Ring customization, $3,500. Gown embroidery and alterations, $2,300. Pre-wedding events, $5,700. Miscellaneous charges, $8,100. The total, $80,000. And at the bottom, in italics, as if they were doing me a favor, due within 30 days, we thank you for your generosity. I stared at it in disbelief. Not because of the amount, but because of the entitlement. No phone call, no warning, no attempt at a conversation, just a cold request from a son who no longer saw the difference between love and obligation. I thought about all the years I'd helped him get through school, covered medical bills, fixed his car, paid for therapy when Savannah suggested he'd do some inner work. I never kept score. I never wanted to. But this was different. This was a transaction. And I wasn't just footing the bill for a wedding that I wasn't invited to. I was being asked to celebrate my own exclusion with a smile and a check. I placed the invoice on the kitchen table and went to the cabinet. Pulled out a bottle of whiskey I'd been saving since my last promotion. Poured myself one glass, sat in the chair Connor used to do his homework in, and took a long, slow sip. The silence of the house echoed around me. No laughter. No music. Just the slow hum of betrayal. The next day I went to the bank, not to withdraw the money but to review my accounts. I'd worked my entire life to build something stable. I didn't live lavishly, I didn't take expensive vacations or buy flashy cars. Everything I earned I invested, in my home, in my future, and in my son. But now, for the first time in decades, I was forced to ask, for what? At the bank, my financial advisor, Jordan Miles, a younger guy with sharp glasses and a gentler tone than most, asked if I was preparing for a big purchase. I told him no. I told him I was preparing for something much more difficult, a boundary. He gave me a look I've seen before. A kind of sympathetic nod, like he'd heard this story more than once. Different people, different amounts, same pattern. Parents drained by adult children who no longer saw them as people, just providers. Jordan leaned in and said something I'll never forget. Mr. Grant, the best thing you can do for your son right now isn't writing a check. It's writing your own future without apology. That line hit me harder than the invoice ever could. I walked out of the bank and sat in my truck for 20 minutes. No music, no calls, just staring through the windshield, trying to breathe through the ache. I wasn't grieving the money. I was grieving the disconnect, the distance between who I thought Connor was and who he'd become. That night, I went through old albums, photos of me teaching him how to fish, his graduation day, the time I drove 8 hours just to surprise him for his birthday. Every picture told a story, but they all led to the same ending. A man who showed up, even when he wasn't asked. A father who never counted the cost, until now. I found myself wondering what Savannah thought of all this. Did she know how the invoice would land? Did she care? Or was she the one who typed it out, printed it, and folded it neatly into the card like it was a polite request instead of a slap to the face? I had my guesses, but the truth didn't matter anymore. Because this wasn't about her. This was about Connor, and me, and the wall that now stood between us, brick by painful brick. The following morning, I made one decision. I would not send the money, but I also wouldn't call him in anger. I wouldn't lash out. That's what they expected. That's what would make it easier for them to dismiss me. Instead, I would wait, quietly, deliberately. I would let the silence speak. They say silence is golden, but sometimes it's surgical, a quiet that cuts deeper than any shouting ever could. And now I was ready to let that silence begin. The invoice didn't come with an explanation, no phone call, no soft lead-up, just an email with the subject line, "Final Breakdown." When I opened it, I stared at the number for what felt like minutes. $80,000. The kind of sum that makes you sit down, even if you're already sitting. Connor hadn't even written a message, just attached a PDF file with wedding expenses in bold at the top, followed by rows of itemized costs. Venue, $25,000. Catering, $14,000. Dress modifications, $3,200. Photographer, $6,500. Live string quartet, $4,800. Flights and honeymoon resort, $21,000. Tips and service charges, $5,500. It wasn't a request. It was an expectation. At the bottom was a polite line in gray font. Your generous support makes this dream possible. I didn't know what was more shocking, that he had the audacity to send it, or that he truly believed I would pay it. It would be one thing if we had talked. If he had come to me months earlier, sat across from me with sincerity and said, "Dad, I need your help." I may have still felt stung by the exclusion, but at least there would have been honesty. But this was clinical, transactional. I might as well have been a corporate sponsor. I scrolled back through our text messages, looking for any clue that this was coming. There was nothing, no hint. Just a few scattered thanks and emojis from the last time I sent him money to cover his car repairs. I forwarded the email to myself, printed it out, and set it on my kitchen counter. I circled the total in red ink, like I was grading a paper, and I sat with it. I didn't react right away. I didn't fire off an angry reply. I just stared at the absurdity of it all. $80,000. I had worked 20 years in the public school system. I was retired now. I lived comfortably, but not lavishly. I had savings, yes, but savings I built through decades of sacrifice, clipping coupons, taking extra shifts, saying no to vacations. It wasn't meant to bankroll rejection. As the shock wore off, something colder began to settle in me. A kind of clarity. Not rage. Not revenge. Just awareness. This wasn't about a wedding. This was about value. What Connor was really saying without saying it was, your presence doesn't matter, but your money does. And that was when I made a decision. Not loudly. Not with fanfare. Just a quiet commitment to myself. I wasn't going to play the role he had cast me in. I wasn't going to be the invisible donor to a celebration I wasn't welcome at. I picked up the invoice and began going through it line by line, not as a father but as a man reading a business proposal. I made notes in the margins, circled the custom ice sculpture, underlined private chef tasting weekend, scribbled a question mark next to gown enhancement fees. It was absurd, it was insulting, but it was also illuminating. Connor and Savannah weren't building a marriage. They were staging a performance, and I was supposed to fund it. Later that evening, I sat at my desk and drafted a response. I didn't curse. I didn't yell. I didn't even say no. Instead, I asked questions. I wrote, "Dear Connor, thank you for sharing the detailed list of expenses. Before I proceed with any financial involvement, I'd like to clarify a few things. 1. Who else is contributing financially, and in what amounts? 2. Why was I not consulted prior to receiving this invoice? 3. Given my exclusion from the wedding, could you explain how this request aligns with our relationship as it currently stands?" I ended it with, "Looking forward to your transparency." I read the email 3 times before sending it, not because I doubted the content, but because I knew this would be a turning point. Not just for the wedding, for everything. 2 days passed. Then 3. On the 4th day, I got a reply. It was short, defensive. He wrote, "Savannah's parents have contributed more than double what we're asking of you. We didn't think it was necessary to have a big conversation. You've always said you wanted to support me, and this is the most important day of my life. We assumed you'd be happy to help. No apology, no acknowledgement of the invitation snub, no recognition of the insult, just assumption." That was all I needed to know. Connor no longer saw me as a person. He saw me as a purse, a safety net, a faceless lifeline. So I closed my laptop, sat back in my chair, and for the first time in a long while, I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because I was awake. I didn't respond with rage. I didn't call to scream or plead. I didn't even let myself stew in bitterness. Instead, I did something far more dangerous. I got quiet. I got still. And I started documenting. Not to be petty, not to get even, but because I needed to see it all clearly, for myself. Every instance, every red flag, every moment I had dismissed out of love or guilt or sheer exhaustion. I opened a notebook, flipped to the first page, and wrote in bold ink, "When love becomes leverage." I began at the beginning, the first time I noticed Connor shifting, not as a son growing up, but as a man drifting away from who I thought he'd become. I wrote down the time he forgot to call me on my birthday, but posted beach photos from Tulum. The time he promised to visit for Thanksgiving, then backed out last minute because Savannah's parents invited them to a wine tasting in Napa. I wrote down the moment I found out secondhand, through a coworker, that my son had gotten promoted because he never told me himself. Then I listed the money, not to keep score but to find patterns. The $2,000 for his first apartment security deposit, the $700 I wired him when his car broke down in college, the $4,500 for a business course Savannah wanted him to take. I wrote it all, not to weaponize it, but to wake myself up. Sometimes when the wound is emotional, you need facts to anchor your truth, and the facts were clear. I had been giving endlessly, financially, emotionally, spiritually, and somewhere along the line that generosity had become expected. Entitled, Devalued. I kept the notebook close over the next few weeks. I'd jot things down whenever a memory struck. I wrote down the last conversation we had before the wedding invite debacle. I remembered asking if he'd like to grab lunch, just the two of us. He said, "Savannah's got me booked all week." Rain check? That rain check never came. I wrote down how I found out about the wedding through my sister, not my son. I wrote down the invoice. I even printed out the email and stapled it to the back page like an exhibit in a courtroom. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I refused to gaslight myself any longer. It's strange, the clarity that comes when you stop arguing with someone who doesn't hear you. The silence becomes its own language. It speaks louder than words ever could. One night, I sat with that notebook and realized something profound. I hadn't lost my son recently. I had been losing him in pieces for years. Like a slow erosion, you don't notice until the structure caves in. But the moment I saw the pattern, I stopped mourning. I stopped hoping for a version of Connor that no longer existed. And I started preparing, not for confrontation, but for self-protection. I scheduled a meeting with my lawyer, not to change my will, yet, but to talk, to ask questions, to get informed. I wanted to know what I could do if this pattern continued. If the entitlement grew, if someday they came after my assets or made medical decisions for me I didn't agree with. I wasn't being paranoid, I was being prepared. The lawyer, a sharp man named Miles Reddick, told me something I didn't expect. He said, "You're not alone. Parents like you come in more often than you'd think. They're not angry, they're heartbroken. But they've learned the hard way that boundaries aren't betrayal. They're protection." That stayed with me. Boundaries aren't betrayal. So I started building them. Not loudly, not cruelly, but firmly. I stopped replying to every text within minutes. I stopped offering money without being asked. And when asked, I said, "I'll think about it," instead of automatically agreeing. I created space, not out of spite, but out of necessity. And in that space, something happened. I started remembering who I was before I became a man constantly trying to prove he deserved respect. I started reading again, fishing again. I called old friends. I laughed more. Not because it stopped hurting, but because I stopped tying my worth to someone else's gratitude. I didn't need revenge, I needed release. And the documentation? That was never for the courts. It was for my own heart. Proof that I hadn't imagined the slow neglect, that I wasn't overreacting, that sometimes the people you do anything for will ask for everything and still act like you've given them nothing. So no, I didn't argue. I documented. And that notebook, it saved me. The wedding day came, whether I was invited or not. June 3rd. I knew the date, even though I'd never received a formal invitation. It had been burned into my mind since the invoice landed on my doorstep. The sun was out that morning, and the air had that stillness you only get before something big happens. But in my house, it was quiet. No tuxedo, no gift, no family gathering, just me, a hot cup of black coffee, and silence. I sat in the same chair I always do, the one by the window where Connor used to wait for the school bus as a kid. I remembered him standing there with his oversized backpack, waving goodbye like he was going on a grand adventure. Now he really was, and he'd made sure I wasn't part of it. I tried not to picture the ceremony, but my mind wandered anyway. I imagined the vineyard, the white chairs lined in perfect rows, Savannah's parents smiling wide for the cameras, acting like they had raised him themselves. I pictured Connor in a sleek navy tux, saying vows in front of a crowd who thought I didn't exist. And when the minister asked, "Who gives this woman?" I knew Savannah's father would step forward with pride, while I sat alone in a house that still echoed with memories of raising the man at that altar. There was no phone call, no text, no last-minute apology or whisper of regret, just that unbearable quiet. I didn't even know if my sister, Janice, had gone. She said she was on the fence, didn't want to pick sides. But I knew her heart. She wouldn't have been able to stay away. I walked around the house like a ghost that day. I straightened picture frames, folded already folded laundry. I wiped clean countertops for the second time. Not because anything needed doing, but because I needed something to hold on to. Something that didn't move without me. Something that didn't pretend I didn't matter. The hardest part wasn't being excluded. It was realizing they didn't think I'd fight it. They counted on my silence. They assumed I'd pay the bill, swallow the insult, and vanish quietly while they toasted champagne in a life I helped build. I didn't cry. I hadn't cried in a long time. But I felt it rise in my chest, that heaviness, that slow, suffocating pressure that settles in when the person you love most treats you like a footnote. It wasn't about a seat at the wedding. It was about being written out of the story entirely. I opened a drawer and pulled out the gift I'd planned months earlier. A hand-carved oak box I'd commissioned from an old friend who does custom woodworking. Inside was a pocket watch passed down from my father, and a note that read, "You may be a man now, but never forget the one who taught you how to stand. I had meant to give it to Connor on his wedding day, a quiet gesture, a symbol of legacy. I ran my fingers over the engraving, the irony bit deep. He'd never see it. And suddenly, I wasn't sure I wanted him to. I set it down and poured myself another coffee. Hours passed. The sun moved across the living room floor like a slow goodbye. At some point, I turned on the TV just for background noise. Anything to drown out the imagined sound of vows and violin strings. But even the television felt too loud. That night, I sat on the porch with the lights off. The sky was dark, the stars indifferent. I wondered if Connor was dancing with his new bride, if he was laughing, clinking glasses, thanking guests, never once thinking of the man who taught him how to tie a tie, shave his chin, and stand tall after failure. Maybe he'd justify it to himself. Maybe he'd say I wouldn't have enjoyed it anyway, or that it was just too complicated. But deep down, I knew the truth. It was never about my comfort. It was about convenience. And in their new world, polished and picture-perfect, I was inconvenient. And yet, I felt strangely at peace. Not because it didn't hurt, but because I finally stopped waiting for an apology that would never come. The wedding went on without me. But for the first time in years, I didn't chase after the version of my son I wished he still was. I faced the version that stood before me now, the one who sent me a bill and an exclusion in the same breath. And I let the old version go. I didn't attend the wedding, but I showed up for myself. And that, in a way, was the start of something new. While Connor and Savannah were off sipping cocktails on some private island, convinced the world revolved around them, I was at home finalizing something they never saw coming. I had mailed them a response weeks before the wedding, folded, sealed, and delivered by hand to their mailbox. No call, no warning. Just a quiet envelope titled, "Regarding the invoice." Inside, I kept it short, just one page. In clean, bold font, it read, "Dear Connor and Savannah, I received your request for $80,000 to fund your wedding and honeymoon. Please consider this my official response. No, respectfully, Joseph Landry." That was it. No guilt, no explanation, just the one word they least expected from me. But I didn't stop there. Connor had always counted on the fact that I never fought back. I was the dad who quietly paid the bills, nodded through disrespect, and stayed generous, even when I was treated like a ghost. That man no longer existed. The day after the wedding, while they were posting sunsets and champagne glasses on Instagram, I contacted my financial advisor. We reviewed everything: accounts, retirement funds, property deeds. I asked him to help me lock it all down. No one, not my son, not his wife, not anyone, would have access to a dime unless I allowed it. Not through manipulation, not through guilt, not through some twisted idea of family obligation. And then I updated my will. For decades, Connor had been my primary beneficiary. Not anymore. I rewrote it from scratch. I designated my estate to a scholarship fund for single fathers who had lost their spouses, men like me, trying to raise children with honor, even in silence. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it to finally honor myself. For once, my name, my work, my sacrifices would go somewhere they'd be respected, not exploited. By the fourth day of their honeymoon, the messages started. Savannah messaged first, of course. No greeting, no warmth. Just, "We saw the envelope. Is this some kind of joke?" I didn't answer. 2 days later, Connor followed up. His tone was colder, tighter. "Dad, I don't understand. You knew we were counting on you. Why would you do this now? Why embarrass us like that?" Embarrass them? I sat with that word. Of all the things he could have said, that one stung. Not because it was true, but because it revealed exactly how little he understood me. I typed slowly, "You weren't counting on me. You were depending on me to never say no. That's not love. That's entitlement." Then I hit send. No reply. From that moment on, their posts changed. The bright captions disappeared. The pictures stopped showing champagne glasses and started showing quiet boardwalks, empty beaches, and moody reflections. "Time to reflect," one post read. I almost laughed. They were finally reflecting, only because they'd lost control. And that's what this was all about. The $80,000 was never just about money. It was a test, a mirror, one final push to see if I'd still cave like I always had. But this time, the mirror cracked in their hands, and instead of bleeding, I watched them flinch. Back home, my life moved on. I walked through my neighborhood park again. had coffee with Marvin like we used to. I even started volunteering on Saturdays. Not because I was lonely, but because, for the first time in years, I felt free. I wasn't tied down by hope that someone might finally appreciate me. I stopped giving my best to people who didn't value even my presence. Then came the voicemail. A week after they returned, Connor called. I didn't answer. I wanted him to sit in that silence, the same silence he had served me for months. His voice shook as he stumbled through his message. Hey, it's me. I know we haven't really talked. I guess I just wanted to say I didn't mean to upset you. We thought you understood. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But it was. It had always been like this. He just hadn't noticed until I said no. I didn't call back right away. I waited 3 days. Then I sent a message. Let's have lunch, just us. No money talk, no drama, just father and son. He didn't reply. And somehow, that silence told me everything I needed to know. The honeymoon had ended, but the real wake-up call was only just beginning. A week passed, then 2. And just when I thought Connor had chosen silence again, I received a message that made me sit down. It wasn't from him. It was from Savannah's younger cousin, Clarissa. I barely knew her. Just a soft-spoken girl who'd offered a quiet hello the few times we crossed paths. But her message came in like lightning through a quiet sky. Mr. Landry, I think you deserve to know what's really been going on. Attached was a screenshot of a group chat, one that included Connor, Savannah, her parents, and a few close friends. The conversation was from 2 months before the wedding. My name appeared 3 times, and each time it felt like a punch to the gut. Savannah's mother had asked, "Has he agreed to pay yet?" Connor replied, "He doesn't know the full number, but he will. He always does. He'll probably cry about it and then send a check like usual." Someone responded with a laughing emoji. Savannah added, "Let him feel useful. It's not like he has anything else going on." Useful. That's what I'd become in their eyes. Not a father, not a human being, just a wallet with a heartbeat. Clarissa didn't stop there. She sent a second screenshot, this time showing Connor bragging that he'd found a way to avoid the drama by not inviting me at all. No invite means no scene. He'll get over it once we send the bill. The guilt will kick in. It always does. Always. That word sliced through whatever hope I had left. It told me this wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, a shared understanding among them all that my role was to stay invisible, keep giving, and never dare to ask for anything in return. I thanked Clarissa. She said she hadn't attended the wedding, partly because of how they spoke about me. She couldn't stomach their entitlement. And I couldn't either. Not anymore. For hours I just sat with that message. Not angry, not bitter, just stunned. The $80,000 invoice was bad, but this was a betrayal that had been planned, calculated, and laughed over. And still, some part of me wanted to believe Connor was just swept up in the stress. But the messages were his. The coldness was his. The manipulation was his. The next morning, I printed out the screenshots and tucked them into an envelope. I wrote Connor a letter by hand. No email, no texting, just ink and truth. It read, "You once asked why I didn't fund your wedding. These are your answers. I raised you better. I expected better. And yet, here we are. A son who speaks of his father as a burden. A man who uses guilt like a crowbar. You thought I'd stay quiet. You were wrong." Then I added one more line. "Your inheritance was never about money. It was about trust. And you've spent it all." I didn't send it. At least not right away. I left it on my desk and walked outside. The breeze was light that morning, the air crisp with early fall, and for the first time in years I felt peace. Not because things were okay between us, but because I had finally stopped trying to earn a place in the life of someone who had long since closed the door. That private message didn't ignite rage. It sparked something more powerful, release. I stopped hoping they'd apologize. I stopped wondering what I could have done differently. And in that stillness, I found the kind of clarity money could never buy. They could keep their wedding, their staged photos, their matching hashtags and filtered moments. I had something far more valuable. My dignity, and I wasn't giving it away again. I didn't tell anyone about the screenshots. I didn't gossip. I didn't spread it around like fire. But small towns have a way of uncovering truths on their own, especially when those truths have teeth. Word got out, not from me, but through whispers. Clarissa's silence didn't last long, and neither did Savannah's ability to stay discreet. One vague comment on social media, something about family betrayal, was all it took to stir curiosity. And curiosity in this town spreads like spilled paint. The grocery store clerks knew. The mailman knew. My barber paused halfway through my haircut to ask if it was true. "Did your son really send you a bill after banning you from his wedding?" he asked, clippers still buzzing near my ear. I smiled faintly and said, "Yes, he did." That's all it took. His mouth opened slightly, but he said nothing. Just nodded and finished the trim with a kind of reverent quiet. But the real shift came when I walked into the diner 2 blocks from my house. I'd been going there for years. Same seat by the window, same waitress named June, who always topped off my coffee before I asked. This time, when I stepped in, the usual noise fell into silence. Not judgmental silence, respectful silence. The kind that made my chest feel heavy and light at the same time. June didn't ask any questions. She just brought my coffee and said, "You did the right thing. People need to stop rewarding disrespect just because it's family." Then she sat down across from me, something she never did during work hours, and shared her own story about being used by people she loved. And like that, something shifted. The community stopped seeing me as the quiet man who got excluded from a wedding. They saw me as something else now. A man who drew the line. A man who said no when it mattered. Even Marvin, my old fishing buddy, who hadn't reached out since he lost his wife, stopped by my porch with 2 beers and a fishing rod over his shoulder. "Heard what happened," he said. "Figured you could use a break." We didn't talk much that afternoon, just cast lines into still water, and sat with the comfort of knowing someone had your back without needing an explanation. Not everyone was supportive, of course. There were a few who whispered that I should have just paid and kept the peace. That family came first, no matter what. But those voices were soft, uncertain, like they knew deep down they were defending something broken. One Sunday after service, the pastor even pulled me aside. He didn't bring up Connor or the wedding. He simply said, "Some wounds only close when we stop pretending they're not bleeding." Then he gave me a firm nod and walked off, leaving me with more clarity than any sermon could have delivered. And still through all of it, Connor remained silent. No calls, no messages, just a hollow space where a son used to be. But this time, the silence didn't hurt. It confirmed everything I'd feared and everything I needed to finally heal. What surprised me most was the letters. Handwritten, folded, sometimes messy. People I barely knew dropped notes in my mailbox. A retired nurse, a high school janitor, even a teenager who said she saw what happened online and wished her own father would stand up for himself the way I did. One letter read, "You reminded me it's okay to walk away from people who only come close when they need something." I kept that one. It sits on my desk next to the unopened envelope addressed to Connor, the one I still haven't decided whether to send. But perhaps the most unexpected reaction came from Savannah's own aunt, Meredith. She stopped me outside the pharmacy and looked me straight in the eye. "They've been spoiled for years," she said. "Nobody ever held them accountable. Until now. And you didn't scream or post some angry rant. You just didn't pay." And somehow that said more than any words could. Then she hugged me. Not a polite hug, a real one. The kind that says, "I see what you've been carrying." In all my years, I never thought telling someone no would be the moment people finally saw me clearly. But here I was, seen, heard, and in a strange way honored. Not because I lashed out, but because I finally drew a boundary and meant it. What the community showed me was this: there are quiet heroes everywhere. People who endure silently, who give and give until they disappear. But every now and then, one of them says, "Enough." And when they do, it gives others permission to do the same. And maybe that's the greatest gift I've given, not just to myself, but to every person who's ever been told that love means sacrificing your dignity. Because real love, it never demands silence in the face of disrespect. It listens. And most importantly, it never sends a bill. I never imagined I'd be sitting in a lawyer's office over something like this. Divorce? Maybe. A business deal gone south? Sure. But my own son stabbing me in the back with an $80,000 bill after banning me from his wedding? That's the kind of betrayal that doesn't just sting. It hollows you out. I wasn't there to start a lawsuit. I wasn't looking to make headlines or drag him through the mud. I just wanted to make sure that from that moment on, I was done being used. Done being the emotional ATM for a family that had no interest in keeping me around unless my wallet was open. Miles Reddick wasn't your typical flashy lawyer. He didn't have marble floors or assistants buzzing around him with tablets. He wore a modest blazer, used a fountain pen, and listened like every word I said mattered. We weren't close friends, but we had history, mutual respect. He'd seen this kind of thing before. Fathers left in the dust after years of quiet giving. Men who'd been too generous for too long and finally reached the end of their rope. I slid the envelope across his desk. Inside, the invoice Connor had emailed me, screenshots from the wedding group chat where they mocked my absence, and a printout of the bank alert I'd received when someone tried to tap into an old line of credit still tied to our old house. Miles leafed through the documents without saying much, but I watched his jaw tighten. By the time he got to the message that read, "He'll pay, he always does," he leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. "This isn't just entitled," he said quietly. "It's coordinated. They knew what they were doing." "I'm not here for revenge," I said. "I'm here for peace. I want to make sure that whatever's left of my assets never ends up in their hands. Not by mistake, not by guilt, not by manipulation." Miles nodded, then smiled that knowing smile lawyers have when they're about to flip the script. "You don't need to fight fire with fire. You just need to stop handing them the matches." And with that, we got to work. He helped me revise my will. Connor's name, gone. He helped me lock down my accounts, freeze any dormant lines of credit, and remove access to anything Connor might have once had his name on. We established legal boundaries so tight you could hear them click into place like a vault door. No speeches, no confrontations, just paper, process, and peace. I left that office feeling lighter, not healed, but clear. And that clarity did something I didn't expect. It gave me space to breathe, to live. I stopped checking my phone every 5 minutes for the next blow. I made myself breakfast without the radio blaring in the background to drown out the silence. I swept the back porch. I opened a photo album I hadn't looked at since my wife passed. I started calling friends I hadn't spoken to in years. I started living like I mattered. 2 weeks later, Miles called me again. This time, there was no small talk. "Your son tried to open a line of credit in your name," he said. "One still tied to the townhouse you co-signed years ago. The bank flagged the signature. They reached out to me directly." I stood there, phone in hand, and felt the cold reality set in. Connor hadn't just pushed me aside emotionally. He was still trying to reach into my pockets behind my back. Not with words, not with guilt, but with forged access and quiet assumptions. Miles asked the question gently but firmly. "Do you want to press charges?" I didn't respond right away. The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Part of me wanted to scream yes. Another part of me just felt numb. After a long pause, I said, "No, not yet. But I want a record. Every attempt, every message, everything." And that's exactly what we did. We documented it all, not to hurt Connor, but to protect me. Because I had finally learned the truth. Boundaries aren't cruelty, they're self-respect. Love without limits is not love, it's martyrdom. And I was done being anyone's martyr. That night, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and unfolded the original invoice again. There it was, plain as day, honeymoon upgrade, $4,500. I laughed, not bitterly, not angrily, just amused. He thought I'd pay for beachfront champagne while I sat at home alone. He thought I'd keep playing the part of the dependable fool. But I didn't cry. I didn't throw the paper away in rage. I folded it neatly, slid it into a file marked closed, and locked it away. The next morning, I trimmed the hedges, cleaned the gutters, and made pancakes. Not for anyone else, just for me. No grand declarations, no explosive confrontations. Just a quiet decision to stop bleeding for people who mistake your wounds for weakness. And as I poured syrup over the plate, I whispered to myself what Miles Reddick had said that day. The cleanest revenge is a paper trail. Let them run into their own mess. The wedding went on without me. The photos told the story loud and clear. Connor and Savannah. Beneath a golden arch, guests in matching pastels, toasts under string lights, and a 3-tier cake with gold trim. My name wasn't mentioned, and my face wasn't there. But in every picture, every pose, I could feel the space I used to fill. There was no warmth behind Connor's smile, no weight behind Savannah's laughter. And then there were them. Savannah parents, Douglas and Janice Ellison, beaming, standing close, praised in the captions as generous pillars of the event. The people who filled the seat I was denied. But I didn't comment. I didn't make a scene. I didn't send a passive-aggressive text or post a vague message online. I let it all unfold in silence. Not because I was weak, but because silence, when used right, is more cutting than rage. And while they were off sipping champagne on a honeymoon I was expected to fund, I was quietly reinforcing the walls they thought didn't exist. Walls that now protected everything I'd spent a lifetime building. 6 months passed like fog lifting. My lawyer, Miles Reddick, had helped me erase every vulnerability they might exploit. Revising the will, freezing joint accounts, and severing financial access point by point. There was nothing left for them to touch, nothing left for them to drain. I wasn't just excluded, I was fortified. Then one afternoon, while I was walking back from the hardware store with a bag of screws and weatherproofing tape, a silver sedan pulled up beside the curb. The window rolled down. Connor stepped out. He wasn't dressed for a visit. No jacket, no warmth, no smile. Just a pale, uneasy face and the look of someone who didn't know if he was there to beg, explain, or accuse. He didn't greet me. No "Hi, Dad," no "Can we talk?" He just pulled a folded letter from his coat pocket and held it out. "I heard you changed the will," he said. "Is it true?" I didn't take the letter. I just looked him in the eye. "Yes, it's true." He looked stunned, like the thought of me actually taking a stand, legally removing him, hadn't even crossed his mind. He blinked, glanced at the sidewalk, then muttered, "You didn't even come to the wedding. You didn't invite me." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, dense, full of everything he didn't want to admit. He tried again. "Savannah parents paid for everything on their end. We just assumed you'd." "You assumed wrong," I cut in. "I wasn't your father when you sent that bill. I was your wallet, and I'm done being that." His mouth opened, then closed again. He looked like a boy caught stealing, ashamed but also resentful that he'd been found out. Finally, without another word, he shoved the letter into my hand and walked off. I didn't read it that day. I waited. A week later, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea and finally unfolded it. A 4-paragraph apology laced with excuses. "I was under pressure," he wrote. "Savannah family had high expectations. I didn't mean to hurt you. I just thought you'd understand." But the final line sealed it. "We can still fix this. I know deep down you want to be part of our lives." He was still trying to cast me in the role of the man who always came through. Still trying to hand me the guilt and call it love. I folded the letter, placed it beside the original invoice, and slid both into a folder labeled "Closed." I wasn't at the wedding. I didn't toast their union or dance under fairy lights. But I was at the finish line. I was there when the dust settled and the lies ran out. And for once, I wasn't the one chasing reconciliation or writing checks to fix damage I didn't cause. They had their wedding, their spectacle, their curated joy, but I had something better. Peace, clarity, and the quiet victory of knowing I'd finally stopped bleeding for people who never intended to stop cutting. And that was worth more than any seat at any table. So after everything, after being erased from the most important day in my son's life, after being treated not like a parent but like a checkbook, I didn't yell. I didn't fight. I simply chose to protect what was mine and walk away with my dignity intact. Not for revenge, but for self-respect, for peace. But I have to ask you, what would you have done? If your own child shut you out of their wedding, then turned around and handed you the bill, would you have paid it? Would you have swallowed your pride and showed up anyway? Or would you have done what I did, drawn the line and walked away? Tell me in the comments, because your story matters too. This channel isn't just about revenge. It's about truth. It's about standing up when you've been stepped on. It's about the strength it takes to say enough. And if this story moved you, if it made you reflect on your own relationships or reminded you that you're not alone, then do me one favor. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and make sure you subscribe to Revenge is Mine, where every week we tell real, raw stories of betrayal, justice, and emotional survival. Because sometimes revenge isn't loud. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is silence, strength, and walking away with your soul intact. Bookmark. Go back. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next story.